The Legend of Zelda series has had a multitude of underlying themes and recurring elements. And one of the most famous or infamous elements, however you want to look at it, is time travel. Or to put it in a more broad sense, the manipulation of time itself. But one of the most pivotal aspects in all of The Legend of Zelda caused what is known as the timeline split, resulting in the fractured Zelda timeline. While the series and fans are no stranger to these aspects, there could be an abundance of possibilities at hand when it comes to the latest Legend of Zelda game, Breath of the Wild 2. And that time travel may not only be a very huge focal point for the game itself, may already shaped it and the original Breath of the Wild in grand possibilities. And now we're going to talk about those possibilities and how time travel could affect Breath of the Wild 2. Let's dive directly into the noise. As a bit of a primer, the reason why we're talking about the whole aspect of time travel and its possibilities in Breath of the Wild 2 is not too long ago the Italian voice actor for Douwert has confirmed that not only is he voicing Douwert in Breath of the Wild 2, but also his ancient ancestor, in which many people believe, myself included, is the original pilot of the divine beast Varudania from the tapestry more than 10,000 years ago, which could insinuate either the idea of time travel in Breath of the Wild 2 or at the very least flashbacks. But considering other aspects we've seen already for Breath of the Wild 2, I want to lean a little bit towards the idea of time travel or time manipulation. So much so that I truly believe that the reason why Breath of the Wild 2's true name is a mystery and potentially a spoiler is due to the idea of having to do with some hardcore specific time travel that Nintendo isn't quite ready to show off in a trailer yet, and that is why they're still keeping the name under wraps at this point. That this mechanic or this lore aspect is going to truly be front and center throughout the entirety of the game, or will have the entire identity of the game attached to it. Which wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility for Zelda games, because we've had The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and Oracle of Ages dealing specifically with time manipulation. I mean, sure, we have A Link to the Past, which has the word past in it, but it didn't really have time travel in it, and it was called Triforce of the Gods in Japan, and yeah. With the possibilities at hand, we have a lot to go over in terms of not only lore, but also gameplay features, specifically with the ideas of combat and traversal. We've already seen the idea firsthand in one of the Breath of the Wild 2 trailers, in which Link was able to manipulate the flow of time for a very specific object, reversing its movement in real time while retaining its kinetic energy. It is this idea that makes me wonder if we cannot see this applied to living beings, if this is even possible to apply to Link himself, leaving behind after images that act as both a source of dodging and perhaps a target for enemies to focus on, either to assist you in combat or to assist you in stealth. Or perhaps using it as a waypoint that will allow you to teleport back to this moment in time before time in real time. Think of it as a faster or more robust version of Feor's Wind, or similar to Echo's ult in League of Legends. And this specific aspect of time manipulation doesn't have to be only for Link or combat or traversal, it could also deal with puzzles, using this ability in a smaller scale in order to put back something nearby that belongs in a place, like a lock to a door or a piece of a bridge, or even to a grander scale in which you can use this power in order to open up portals or doors to an area and see how it was like way back when. And depending how grand this power could be, this could either be seeing and believing. Not only seeing a glimpse of what was, but possibly also entering that moment in time. Which brings us into the story element, the lore element of how time travel could affect Breath of the Wild 2. While flashbacks is something that we definitely could see revisited from Breath of the Wild into Breath of the Wild 2, the way the story was presented in the original Breath of the Wild was something that a lot of fans came together and said that it could have been better. While the story and themes of Breath of the Wild I really did enjoy, I will admit the presentation of said story definitely needed some work. And to that end, instead of seeing what happened 10,000 years ago, possibly thanks to Daruke's ancestor, why not live it? Either by entering that point in time yourself, or possibly inhabiting the body of your past self, the Link, the hero of that age that worked with the ancestor of Daruk. And when thinking about this perspective, the sky is truly the limit when it comes to the secrets and the truths that we can find out from going into the past 10,000 years, or maybe even beyond that, before the time of the original Breath of the Wild, possibly finding out what happened to the Triforce, what happened to Ganondorf and the Calamity's origin, and maybe even finally exposing the timeline in which where Breath of the Wild could finally take place along with that of the sequel. But like before in previous Zelda games, if we go into the past, we have to consider what that can mean for gameplay of the current and the future of Breath of the Wild 2. Considering this, we have to compare it to a previous time travel or time manipulation aspects within the Legend of Zelda, including that of Skyward Sword, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, and for this video I will count Age of Calamity. With these titles in particular, they offer different ideas when it comes to the theories relating to the use and outcomes of time travel, such as the bootstrap paradox, multiverse theory, and singularity loop. While not first in the timeline, I feel we need to address Ocarina of Time before anything else, as the outcome of this game's ending has the most tremendous impact on the rest of the Zelda timeline, and thereby kind of sets the precedent of how time travel is applied within the Legend of Zelda games, for the most part. Within Ocarina of Time, various aspects within time travel theory is explored, including that of singularity loops and bootstrap paradoxes, where you would think from traveling to the past and the future, where changing elements from the past going into the future were either always meant to be or have already been, and that destiny will shape one way or another. But then we get to the ending of Ocarina of Time. After Link, Zelda, and the sages were victorious against Ganondorf, Zelda made the decision to send Link back to the past before Ganondorf was even able to strike in order for him to recapture his lost childhood. Both Link and Zelda's decision after that point led to a new universe being born, thus playing into the multiverse theory, in which Link was able to warn Zelda and the royal family of Ganondorf's incoming treason and thereby erasing the events of the future we played in Ocarina of Time from his timeline, creating the child timeline. But the future in which they were victorious continued on in its own timeline, creating the adult timeline. And of course, the what if scenario, if Link were to lose against Ganondorf, created the downfall timeline. Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, more like the Legend of Zelda and the Multiverse of Sadness. This shows that time itself is incredibly malleable in the Legend of Zelda series if you decide to take a completely different route than what was quote-unquote intended. Due to the grand weight of the idea of the multiverse and the fact that it already kind of exists within Zelda, I really doubt that Breath of the Wild 2 is going to deal with multiverse theory in creating a new universe due to the effects of time travel, but play into the idea that's already being affected by the multiverse, the Zelda multiverse, and then deal with a type of singularity loop, as this popular theory deals with the idea of destiny and that it will be achieved one way or another. And that idea already relates into Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, in which the idea, the mechanic itself of the 3-day cycle, which deals with the singularity loop, in which while there may be variances in specific occurrences, the intended outcome or destiny will and must follow suit, with Link being allowed to be an anomaly in that in order to bring in that outcome, with him retaining his memory, his items from every time he resets the loop in Majora's Mask. But how does the singularity loop deal with the multiverse theory that happened with Ocarina of Time's ending? Well, the really messed up way to look at it is that the singular destiny that all three outcomes share is not Link's victory, but Ganondorf's defeat one way or another, in which Ganondorf was defeated in the adult timeline, Ganondorf was prevented from ever achieving victory in the child timeline, and although he was victorious against Link, a desperation move in the downfall timeline still allowed him to be sealed by the sages. So that idea in itself is a paradox combining that of multiverse theory and singularity looping, in which both ideas are true while not being true at the same time. But the reason why I'm bringing that whole conundrum up is really important, that's going to play into the idea of how Breath of the Wild 2 can be affected by time travel, or has already been affected. But then we come to Skyward Sword, as towards the end of the game, we make use of the Gate of Time to not only keep Zelda safe in the past and also act as a lock to demise, but to also do something that you would think would have grand implications and deal with multiverse theory again, and that is going into the past to defeat demise. Because you would think destroying demise in the past would lead to a universe in which the events of Skyward Sword never happened, and thus creating a new branch in the timeline. But with the character of Impa and the life tree both being constants, you would think it would play into a singularity loop, or perhaps even a bootstrap paradox. For me, the case of Skyward Sword is one of the most confusing aspects because we have to deal with those and the variables including that of the Triforce, the destruction of the Gate of Time, along with Link, Zelda, Groose, and possibly Him retaining their memories and sense of self. which makes me believe that Skyward Sword may deal with several ideas surrounding the principles and concepts of the discarded timeline or the abandoned timeline hypothesis, in which while certain items and aspects can be taken from one timeline, once certain constants are removed from said timeline, then it's pretty much frozen, dissolved, abandoned by time itself. However, an event like this may cause all that is lost from that timeline to be found somewhere else in time. Now keep that in mind, we're getting to the end game here, because we need a little bit of treatment from how Twilight Princess addressed time travel. Because although it was brief, it did have heavy implications in how you moved forward in the story. And I'm talking about how Link was able to access a past version of the Temple of Time. But rather than actually going to the past, I want to argue that Twilight Princess made use of past conjuration, in which the Door of Time in Twilight Princess was able to recreate a segmented, localized version of the past Temple of Time for you to explore. This idea is supported by the fact that when you go into that Temple of Time, you don't see a past version of the Master Sword in the pedestal. And this idea allows for Link from the future to manipulate a past version of the Temple of Time and bring items and equipment from that recreated point in time without affecting the past itself, which would explain how he was able to recover a shard of the Mirror of Twilight and bring the Dominion Rod from the past, thus reclaiming or recreating lost elements without directly affecting the past in which they came from in order to dodge any implications in the future. And this finally wraps up with Age of Calamity's use of time travel. As with Twilight Princess, where we bring things back from the past into the future, restore them, in Age of Calamity we lose things to the past forever, as Terraco's use of time travel into the past from Breath of the Wild into Age of Calamity and eventually replacing that timeline's version of Terraco leads to multiverse theory on a smaller scale, but does something that the other Zelda games have not up until this point when you consider that Age of Calamity is technically canon, and that is borrowing people, characters from a doomed future in order to bring in a better one. And it is thanks to that idea of temporary temporal travel combined with all previous aspects that we've talked about when it comes to time travel and how it could affect Breath of the Wild 2, is that while exposing the timeline possibly for the sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and all other instances of time travel that's happened in the Zelda timeline before it, it could lead to the idea and answer the big question of how so many different facets of different ideas and concepts from different timelines are present within the original Breath of the Wild. And that's because the multiple uses of time travel, the multiple events of creating and discarding new and old timelines, bringing and losing all of these concepts, all comes down to the one sentence that they have to go somewhere. Either mentally, spiritually, or physically, concepts that we've seen in differentiating timelines throughout the Zelda multiverse have found their way somehow to Breath of the Wild. And that is the final idea of how time travel could affect Breath of the Wild 2. The idea of entropic overflow. Think about it, in every timeline, in almost every Zelda game, there's always a constant of Link, Zelda, Impa, Ganon, Ganondorf, in certain other degrees, Tingle, Beetle. And of course, we have to think about all of the variants that exist in Clock Town that we've seen before in Ocarina of Time when playing Majora's Mask. The idea itself is that destiny is unmoving and that ideas, concepts, people, items, locations must be recreated or brought forth into existence one way or another when one timeline is created or one other timeline is disregarded. Darmani exists in the child timeline but doesn't in the adult or downfall timelines, but he will find his way into existence. The Master Sword was lost to the depths in the adult timeline, yet still decides to endure in the child and downfall timelines. Do you see where I'm getting at? The whole idea of creation that was dictated by the old gods cannot change, cannot falter, cannot waver, and that their creations will find life, will find reference one way or another in all facets of the Zelda timeline. And Breath of the Wild is the idea in which it comes to fruition. And that deals into the whole identity of the Legend of Zelda. That while everything we've heard, everything we've seen in all these past games have existed in one universe or another, in one timeline or another, they all bleed into each other. They all come together as legends. Legends that have made their way into Breath of the Wild and into Breath of the Wild 2. While the timeline split may have broken that in Ocarina of Time, the truth that we seek in Breath of the Wild 2 is going to repair that. And that is how time travel could affect Breath of the Wild 2. And it is this discovery of this potential fact that could play into the identity of the true game's name. But hey, only time will tell. I hope you enjoyed the video. Be sure to like, share, and most probably subscribe to HMK while leaving a comment on your theories on how time travel could affect Breath of the Wild 2 and beyond. Until the next Zelda video, this has been HMK, and I'll check you guys later.